Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and this lecture is going to be about Nasze Wsio, as he's known, basically the founder or the father of modern Russian literature, Aleksandr Sergeyevich Pushkin. I have a whole slide here dedicated to Pushkin's family background because it is actually quite interesting and something that he wrote about quite a lot in both his poetry and his prose. His father was from the Russian nobility, and his mother was also from the Russian nobility, but also descended from Abram Petrovich Ganibal. We can see a bust of him there on the left on the slide. And Abram Petrovich Ganibal was a very interesting character. He was a Cameroonian prince, probably. We think now that he was from what is now Cameroon. And when he was a child, he was kidnapped by the Ottomans and brought to Istanbul and then sent to Russia as a gift, basically, to Peter I, because having exotic pages from all over the world was a thing that the European nobility was doing at the time, and so Peter had to do it too. So Ganibal was sent to St. Petersburg, and Peter took such a shine to him that he named him his godson, which is why he is Abram Petrovich. He took Peter's name for his patronymic. He was educated and he rose to a high rank in Russian society. He actually became a general and had the ear of Peter and then later the Empress Elizabeth. And so he occupied this very important position in Russian society despite originally being from Cameroon. And he had, I believe, 11 children with his second wife, one of whom was Pushkin's grandfather on his mother's side. And this was a fascinating, aspect of the family history, but also something that not everyone took a great amount of pride in. Obviously, in the 18th and 19th century, in Europe, being of mixed race was a mixed blessing, shall we say. And it was a very different situation than what we had in the US because there was not institutionalized African slavery the way we had in the US. So it was a very different situation. Nonetheless, it was like I said, a mixed blessing. And there was this fear on Pushkin's mother's family's side of looking too black. And there was this belief that every generation had a quote unquote black child, and that person was sort of unwelcome in the family. Black child meaning that they were clearly of African descent, and their African descent was very clear in their features. And in Pushkin's generation, he was the quote unquote black child of the family. He looked obviously African in his features, although he had blue eyes, for example, but he still had obviously African features in many ways. And this is probably why he was not his parents' favorite child. And he had a lot of issues about his relationship with the rest of his family and with his own appearance, and considered himself to be quite ugly, and it's all quite sad. But on the other hand, he was very proud of his descent from Abram Petrovich and wrote about it extensively in both his poetry and his prose, and frequently mentioned his African heritage in his writings. So this is just an interesting fact about Pushkin that is widely known in Russia, but is not necessarily discussed about him in the West as much because people don't read him as much in the West. Pushkin had a brilliant education for his time. He was sent to the Lyceum, Lycée, at Tsarskoye Selo, which is a kind of a suburb outside of St. Petersburg. And this was a high school, but it was sort of the equivalent of going to college at the time. And it was the place where he was the most happy, and he wrote about it his whole life, his happy days at the Lyceum. Again, he probably wasn't very happy with his family, but when he was at the Lyceum, he made a lot of friends and was welcomed into that circle. And he immediately impressed his peers and his teachers with his poetic talent. And he published his first short poem at 15. And then he published his first long poem, Ruslan and Ludmila, at 20. So he was a very precocious talent who was already writing what was widely considered and is still widely considered to be very good poetry in his teens. And already in this very early work, we can see characteristics of his style, such as humor. He injected a lot of humor into his poetry. His infamous lightness. Prior to this, Russian poetry had been mainly things like odes to the empress and stuff like that, and celebrations of great victories and things like that. And he focused on more personal things, and he had very light subject matter and this light style, this sparkling use of the Russian vernacular. As we discussed with Lomonosov introduced the idea of using the Russian vernacular mixed in with Old Church Slavonic. But it was Pushkin who really took the Russian vernacular and turned it into something appropriate for literature and wrote in a way that clearly sounded, and still to this day sounds like conversational Russian, but was also very structured classical verse. And so already in his teens, he was demonstrating this humor, this lightness, this sparkling wit, and this beautiful flowing use of the conversational vernacular in his verse. The dominant artistic style in the early 19th century in Europe was Romanticism. And Pushkin was very caught up in Romanticism in his 20s. Although right from the beginning, he didn't completely embrace it. He always engaged it with lightness and humor, the kind of lightness and humor that he used in all of his writing. And so he took on the romanticism of Byron. He was very impressed with Byron, but he gave it his own twist and had this very sort of humorous, satirical version of Byronism that openly mocked Byronism sometimes. At the same time, he was living through a fairly difficult period in his own life. In the early 1820s, he was exiled, and first he was sent to the Caucasus, and then he was put in house arrest in his family estate in Mikhailovskaya. And this was very difficult for him personally, but from a literary standpoint, we should all be grateful because he got a lot of writing done and really took his own writing in a new direction and set all of Russian literature in a new and very interesting direction. And the thing that really made his name was the poema, which is a long epic poem, sort of a long narrative poem, Kafkaski Plennik, or Prisoner of the Caucasus, which was a huge bestseller in its day. And he followed it up with a couple more poemi, The Fountain of Bakhchisarai, Bakhchisaraysky Fontan, and Tsigani, Gypsies. And he began his novel in verse, Eugene Onegin. And all of these were heavily influenced by English and German Romanticism, and especially the Romanticism of Byron. But again, he injected all of this lightness, this irony, this humor, this satire in it that was not present as much in the original English and German Romanticism. And he also had specifically Russian settings and Russian themes. So, for example, Prisoner of the Caucasus was written while he was in the Caucasus at a time when Russia was expanding into the Caucasus. And it's this romantic story that's also about contemporary Russian society and all of this anxiety about colonial conquest and the pros and cons of it. And it still resonates today because Russia still has issues in the Caucasus. And so you see all of these updated modern versions of The Prisoner of the Caucasus about the recent Chechen wars, for example. This story continues to resonate and continues to be rewritten for the present day. So already, although he was in some aspects writing very derivatively, he was explicitly following in the footsteps of English and German Romanticism, he was doing so very much so in his own way and in a very specifically Russian way as well. And again, using the Russian vernacular in a way that it had never been used before for literary writing. In his 30s, which was also the 1830s, because he was born in 1799, so his decades lined up with the century's decades. In his 30s, Pushkin's verse became more serious and metaphysical, although much of it wasn't published at the time. It was not really publishable. And he also did what he called this turn to stern prose, and he began experimenting with prose. And he felt that poetry was very easy, and it just kind of poured out of him unstoppably when he was feeling inspiration, and he considered it to be kind of light and frivolous and not serious, whereas prose was serious, and he wasn't ready to work on it until he was in his 30s. And with his prose, again, he was very different from what had come before. There was not very much prose writing in Russian literature at the time, and he took what there was and he went in a new direction, which was very spare, and he developed this style that was very spare and compact and had this sort of element of poetry to it, and that every word had lots of meaning. And once again, he was looking to other examples, other authors, other genres, other countries, and then taking them and giving his own twist to it. So the Bielkin tales, for example, each tale is in a different popular genre of the period, but with his own twist, which frequently has a characteristic humorous or ironic or satirical turn to it, as we will discover when we read The Station Master or any of the other Bielkin tales. And he also began working on a biography of his ancestor Gunnibal, who again had featured heavily in his life, even though he never met him in person, of course, but he was very aware of this legacy that he had, and he began working on a biography of Gunnibal, but unfortunately was unable to finish it before his death. Like many Russian poets, Pushkin died young, and he was the first, but not the last, to die in a duel. He got into a duel with his brother-in-law over his wife's honor. There was a rumor going around that his brother-in-law was messing around with his wife, and Pushkin challenged him to a duel over this and was subsequently killed in the duel. And it is reasonable to think that this was a kind of suicide on his part. He was more and more unhappy with his situation and essentially put himself in a position where he was likely to be killed, and then he was killed. And so we lost him when he was still in his 30s and was just starting these new and interesting directions in his writing. We don't know what we lost, what he would have brought to literature had he been able to continue to develop. But he definitely lived by the motto of live fast, die young. And his fame continued to grow after his death. At this point, he is considered the father of modern Russian literature. He is naše vsё, as Dostoevsky called him, our everything. And he left a huge mark on Russian literature, of course. His chief innovation was combining this neoclassical syllabitonic poetry that Lomonosov had introduced with the Russian vernacular, but not the sort of coarse Russian vernacular that was commonly used, but with this elegant sort of Frenchified Russian vernacular, and also the seriousness and sublimeness of English Romanticism. So he brought all of these things together, neoclassical syllabitonic poetry, the use of the Russian vernacular that any Russian speaker could understand, the elegance and lightness of French verse and the intensity and sublimity of English Romanticism. And he brought them all together in both poetry and then later in prose. Obviously, he wasn't writing syllabitonic prose, but he was borrowing from Western literary genres in his prose, but creating this specifically Russian style of prose that was uniquely his own, but that went on to have a huge effect on Russian literature in later years. And you can see on the right here, we have a huge statue of him. There's a huge statue of him in downtown Moscow. There's statues of him all over the place. He is one of the most important figures in Russian culture and is this kind of touchstone or founding figure within Russia that unites what is a very diverse and disparate nation. So it's probably appropriate that he himself came from this somewhat unusual and diverse background, because he has been this unifying figure for Russia for the past 200 years. And in general, literature is one of the main things that Russian culture and Russian society is united around. And this was a deliberate choice by the Soviets. They were continuing something that had started before, but they deliberately strengthened it in the 20th century. And so Russian literature, and especially Russian poetry, is something that everyone from the former USSR or from modern-day Russia knows, identifies with, and sees as part of their heritage and part of their culture in a way that is less the case in American culture for certain. We don't have this veneration of American literature the way Russian speakers have this veneration of Russkaya literatura. And Russkaya literatura, it's not Rossiyskaya literatura, it's Russkaya literatura. It is not confined to the boundaries of the present-day Russian Federation. This is anywhere where the culture of Rus has had a footprint. And so all of this Russkaya kultura, the culture of Rus, which is within the boundaries of the modern-day Russian Federation, but also outside the boundaries of the modern-day Russian Federation, is united by this devotion to Russkaya literatura in general and Pushkin in particular. And so we can think of him as this colossus-like figure who stands astride Russian history and Russian culture and brings it all together.